Okay, is that everybody in? I can't.
Hello, everyone. Good
There you
morning.
go. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm just making sure that is that everybody in?
I
Have
think
we all,
so, as far as we can see.
perfect. Okay, so thank you.
So far, yes, and sorry, Neve, as more
Yeah, no,
people
you're
come
fine.
in, I'll just let them in and then I'll mute.
Perfect. Okay, so we might get started then altogether if that's okay. We'll just let people trickle in as they come through. If anything happens while I'm talking and if my volume goes, you can feel free to let me know. But just firstly, I just want to say absolutely thank you to everybody for joining us today. And sorry, I can't see the slides, Bernie. I can just see Bernie. Are they there? Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to welcome everyone today, and it's great to see so many people interested in today's meeting. It's the first of our joint event, actually, with the Early Career Research RIG and the Leadership Preparation Development RIG. So we just want to welcome you all. So here today we have Bernie, who's representing the LPD RIG, and myself, Niamh Lafferty, and Judy Chandler from the Early Career Researchers RIG. And just a brief, sorry, slip on to the next slide. Thanks. So the Leadership Preparation Development RIG just focuses on research and practice in developing educational leaders, at all levels. So their members explore innovative approaches to leadership preparation, mentoring, and professional development. So they really look at leadership preparation programs, professional development strategies, mentoring and coaching practices. Then ourselves on the Emergent Researcher RIG. So we're focused at early career researchers in the area of educational management and leadership. And we provide networking opportunities, so methodological guidance and career development resources. We've also in the past provided research methodology in the workshops. We've done some peer networking events and some publication and presentation supports for those in those early stages of research. So today we're coming together then. Sorry, I just slipped to the next slide if I can. It's not letting me. There we go. Thank you so much. So today, look, the purpose of today is that we're going to explore both the opportunities as well as the challenges that can exist for researchers when they're choosing and engaging with various methodologies in educational leadership research. So we're very aware that can be a tricky kind of minefield to go through and to discuss, and they'll all have their different challenges. But also there's a lot of opportunity out there to create some really, really noteworthy knowledge. So with that goal today of kind of talking about how we're going to battle those opportunities and those challenges, we're delighted to have two guest speakers with us today. The first speaker that we're going to have with us is Ella Grügeleit, who is a doctoral researcher at the University of Basel. Her research focuses on school leadership, distributed leadership, and educational governance. And there's a particular emphasis then on organizational development in schools. Her thesis, she employs an ethnographic research in which she combines shadowing type observations, qualitative interviews, and documents analysis with a grounded theory framework. And all that then to explore the complex dynamics of cooperation and sense making in school development processes. Also today we have Professor Megan Crawford, who is an established author, so you may have come across some of her works previously, having published over 50 articles and book chapters. She is a former primary school educator, having worked as a deputy head teacher before transitioning into higher education, where she's specialising in teaching and research and where educational policy meets practice, which I know will be very relevant to a lot of people today. And she's also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, has taught across 5 different universities, and has carried out research for the Department of Education, where she explores topics such as school leadership, career progression, and performance management. So we're really excited to have both of you here today. So just firstly, thank you very much, Megan and Ella, for joining us. And just for everybody that's here, we are going to have time for a Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions while either of our guest speakers are speaking, just to jot them down, and we'll leave them for the end, and we'll have that time then at the end to address all questions. So with that, I hope it's okay if we just transfer over to Ella. Thank you again, Ella, for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I'm gonna try to share my screen with you. Here we go. All right. All good? You see my slides?
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. So I'm delighted to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit around my thesis. Few sentences to myself, maybe in the first place. I'm originally from Germany, now working and living in Switzerland. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Basel and the University of Applied Sciences and Arts, Northwestern Switzerland, which is not the shortest name. And I had the opportunity to take a really close look at how schools work, how schools are developed jointly by teachers and principals. And that's what we're going to dive into, especially into the methodological part of it. So first of all, where are we? Our study was based in Switzerland, especially in 2 cantons. So my thesis is part of a larger project where we had the opportunity to go into schools in the German-speaking part and in the French-speaking part, because Switzerland has a couple of national languages, and we had the pleasure to look at 2 of those cantons. My thesis is based on the German-speaking part, so I will be focusing on the canton of Argovia, or Aargau in German. And for those who are wondering how that is going to look like in a couple of weeks, it's about this. So this is where I'm working and living. For those who need an invitation to come and visit, this is your sign. But before we dive into Switzerland as a beautiful country, I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical background of my study and also our project. So basically, in the heart of our study lies an understanding of leadership as a practice. So as a practice that unfolds in the dynamics between formal leaders, followers, and the situation over time. So we're trying to step away a little bit from the formal role. A lot of the studies around school leadership are mainly focusing on those who are equipped with a formal leadership role. But practice looks a little bit different because there are a lot more people involved in leadership practices. So that was one of the central aspects of my study and our project as well. So we're using Spillane's model of distributed leadership. In Switzerland, just to give a little bit of a frame of the educational governance, we have 3 main players, if you want to say so, which is the municipality on the one side. So Switzerland is a highly federalized country, meaning the cantons and sometimes even the municipalities have a lot of leverage. So they can set their own rules, which they do. So this is based on the canton of Aargau. In the canton of Aargau, the municipality plays a very central role because they are basically responsible for the strategic management of the schools. They should delegate powers to the principal as the body of operational management. And then we have the teachers, and that's where things get really interesting because the teachers in their professional mandate are also responsible for organizational tasks, for administrative tasks that go beyond the classroom. So we have a little bit of shared responsibility between the formal school leaders and the teachers. But the boundaries are somewhat unclear, somewhat blurry, and that makes it a bit of an opaque field of power, as one of our colleagues here in Switzerland described it. So for me, as a former teacher myself too, when I started researching in Switzerland, that relationship was really interesting. So there we come to the initial questions of my study, which were intentionally quite broad in the beginning, and you will understand in the course of my presentation why. So I'm using an ethnographic approach, like Neve already described. It's an exploratory study. So in the beginning, my questions were not very narrow because I didn't quite know what to expect yet. So they became clearer in the course of the study. One of the main reasons is the approach that I've chosen, which is grounded theory. Maybe some of you are already familiar with that. I'll try to break it down a little bit for those who are not very familiar or haven't worked with it yet. It's often or sometimes described as a form of data analysis, while in reality, it's actually a lot more than just data analysis. It's encompassing the whole process from setting up a study to collecting your data, analyzing your data, and eventually building your theory. There are three main steps. And there it depends a little bit what version of the grounded theory we're looking at. I'm following Strauss and Corbin. So here we have 3 stages, but there I have to mention that those always have to work together. So it's not the case that you finish one stage and then you move on, but it's always alternating between these stages. In the first stage, so when you collect your first sets of data, there is a lot of open coding, which basically in the beginning means line by line breaking open the data, so taking a very close look at what you have on your hands. In the next stage, in the axial coding, you try to connect concepts and ideas that you've seen in the first stage in the open coding that came up as potentially relevant for your research focus. So there you start to understand connections between concepts that you could see. And then in the selective coding part, you go back to your whole set of data and choose which parts are especially relevant. That also means excluding parts of your data. And that also means probably collecting more data to get a more specific understanding of those aspects that you've chosen prior to that. So Strauss and Corbin are suggesting the use of a coding paradigm, which I can only recommend for those who would ever like to work with grounded theory, because it really helps to work with large sets of data like mine. Here, we're trying to understand the condition, the context, and the consequences of those phenomena that we've identified as particularly relevant. I'll go into these aspects later on when I'm going deeper into my study, but first, what am I even dealing with? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the types of data that I've been using. So in the first place, and a large part of my study is the observational data, so the shadowing type of observations, which basically means following people during their daily life, pretty much anywhere apart from the bathroom, maybe. Then I've been doing a lot of interviews. So I've been talking to school leaders, I've been talking to teachers, and also members of the municipality. But there I have to mention that I excluded the members of the municipality just because of the amount of data that I already had. And another really important part is the document analysis. So the framework in which the actors are working. So what I've shown you before, the governance system, the legal mandates, the professional mandates, and so on. And also school-related documents. So basically anything that could give me an insight how leadership works in the specific context. Bring it together a little bit what I've been working with the last couple of years. So basically, I started with an explorative phase in one school, which was 4 weeks, so 1 month. Here, things were quite easy in the beginning. I had 2 school leaders, rather small school, 5 interviews in total for this school. And I thought the study can go on like that until I met my second school, which had 7 school leaders, several buildings. So the complexity basically already exploded at the second school. And in my last stage, I added another school, which is not in here yet, but yeah, it was quite a large set of data in the end. So in total, I had around 28, 27 weeks of observation and several interviews with those actors from the school. Grounded theory is quite a special case to say, because what I mentioned before, the phases of analysis always play together, so they always have to be seen as one piece. Basically, we're trying to step away from the actual data and get more into a conceptualizing, into a building theory part, and therefore we're employing theoretical sampling, and we try to reach a stage of theoretical saturation, which means that we create concepts, so we understand the phenomena that are identified so well that by collecting further data, we don't gain any further insight. So that's why in the beginning of my study, I didn't define how many interviews I want to have or how many weeks of observation. That was based on the research process itself. When I started to visit those schools, or I was lucky enough to visit those schools, I had to first understand what we're talking about. What is the collaboration between teachers and school leaders about? So I looked at the legal framework in the beginning. I looked at the professional mandates in the beginning, the leadership models that are employed in this school. And then I tried to understand from the first couple of weeks of observation, what is the collaboration about? So when teachers and school leaders are working together, what are the main issues? I started clustering and grouping, and I'll get into that. And prior to the observational time, I started doing the interviews. So I first finished the whole set of observation, basically, and then went into the interviews, also to gain additional insights. So aspects that I haven't fully understood in the observations, for example, I could go back into and ask them directly in the interviews. By that, I started clustering issues. So what are we collaborating on? What are the main fields? And here, pretty quickly, I think it was at the first school already, I started to understand that especially the field of the pedagogical alignment and the direction was a really important area in which teachers and school principals collaborated. So I started focusing on this. So the part of the school development issues came down or came in to my study, not from the beginning, but in the course of my study. So that was one of the main aspects that I focused on. Still, in the first sets of data collection, it was very chaotic. I think that's part of grounded theory. You still don't really understand what this is about. There's a bunch of different factors that seem to play a role, and it doesn't seem very clear-cut what we should look at. So I tried to break it down a little bit and also to narrow the focus. And in the area of the pedagogical alignment, I understood, especially from the interviews, that the values and the understanding of individual actors really play a role in how they collaborate and how they participate in school development projects or initiatives. So I started to put this into the center of my study as well. So when I was talking to the school leaders and to the teachers, I understood that first of all, we're not talking about one school necessarily, but more about compartments. So there's different subcultures in a school that we need to look at individually. So for me, my focus was to understand how one school leader works and the team around them. So which people, which actors are really relevant. From the outside, when you start to observe, it seems very, very blurry. So patterns, established patterns like cooperation patterns, participation patterns from the outside are often not very easy to understand. But when interruptions come into play, for example, a new school development initiative that could thread the status quo, we start to understand a lot more. That's where the meetings get a little bit more tense. That's where, where people voice more what they think and how they feel. So that's why the school development processes as a form of interruption of the daily flow was a really interesting aspect. So following the process of data reduction, I applied a couple of criteria. So for me, that was school development processes that are not only relevant for one part of the organization, but for a lot more than that. So for a whole school. There, here we go. I started to include another theoretical lens, which was sense making and sense giving. For those who are not familiar, please ask after my presentation, but I think you will understand in the course of the following slides, which I'm going to try to go through in the time that is remaining, which is quite limited.
5 minutes. Thanks, Ella.
Yes, perfect. So here you can see how I narrowed down my research questions. So I included the school development processes and I included the patterns of participation. And that's what we're going into now because it's one of the main focus or the main results. So by comparing those different schools and how different actors participated, I could understand that there's different modes of engagement. So the way, the nature in which actors participated, but also especially from the interviews, from the narratives of the actors, that there's different tendencies of assessment, so how they look at school development. This is part of my results. So here I try to cluster different assessment tendencies and different engagement modes. So what you can see here, the squares are teachers, the circles are school leaders, and the colors are different schools. So this is just one example of two schools. And I started to cluster and describe those groups a little bit closer. So we could see that some people look at school development as a great opportunity for growth on different levels. So for example, teachers would appreciate school development initiatives if it's directly helpful for their individual teaching. Or a lot of school leaders would refer to school development initiatives as really rich for the school as an organization, for the representation and so on. And there were different, so when we look at the modes of engagement, there were different ways in which those actors participated. So we could see that there's some people that are really proactive, innovative, come up with great ideas, are very involved. And there is other people that might be a little bit more holding back and so on. So clustering those, I came up with better descriptions of these types. But for me, I understood that this is not, this is dynamic, basically. It's not a static model that we look at, but there are factors that determine how people act and how they see school development. So I included some moderators, or I could find some moderators. So that's just some examples. There are more. For example, the degree of perceived autonomy was really important for very, very involved and active teachers. So it's self-actualizers, for example. If we take away that, I have the time, by the way, I'm just going to finish a couple of slides, then I'm done. The degree of autonomy was really important for some of those teachers. So we could see that if we take that away, they might actually get into a different level, and they might actually become a different type of participant in school development projects. Or if we look at the degree of application, so how relevant is that for my daily work? We could see that pragmatic people that might be a little bit more on the careful and critical side can become really, really proactive and involved if they see that application relevance. And another one that I would also consider really important, especially for teachers that have been working in a school for a long time, is the continuity for. So when we look at what have we already established before this new initiative, those people that feel very connected with the status quo, for them it's relevant that the new initiative has some connections to the old one, or is building upon what they've already reached. So if they feel we're, as a school leadership team, for example, we're taking away what was already established, they might even get into the group of rejectors. So if they don't quite understand how that connects to what they've already done before. Just in a nutshell, what is important in these kinds of studies if we're thinking about quality? Here, there are a couple of criteria or principles. First of all, transparency. So memo writing and writing is really important. We always need an empirical grounding, so we cannot leave the data too much. We have to always stick very closely to the data. Be sensitive. So we need to include theoretical approaches that really suit our data. For example, the sense-making and sense-giving lens. There needs to be a variation. So we need to include different condition, context factors, and so on. We do that by constant comparison. And a theoretical saturation to ensure that's integrity and validity in the end of the day. So transparency really is a key factor, and we need to make sure that we are in a grounded theory study sharing a lot. So for me, it was super relevant to have research groups that I can exchange and share ideas with, and also talk to my participants to make sure that what I found relevant was also relevant to them. I'm happy to dive into this more whenever you have the chance to ask questions, but I hope that gave you a little bit of insight into a grounded theory study. So thank you very much, and sorry for the, I think, 2 minutes over the time. Thanks a million.
Thank you so much, Ella, for that. That was absolutely fantastic. I can't wait to ask you some questions at the end, so I definitely have some. Okay. And just with that, I just want to pass over then to Megan, if that's okay.
Whoops. I was doing very well until I clicked the wrong button. I'll try one more time. Right, let's go. How am I doing? Can you see anything?
Yes, yeah, we can see it.
Yep.
Yep, that's perfect.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry, I've got a bit of a light problem in this corner because I'm under the stairs. So I may be plunged into darkness at any moment. So apologies. Okay, well, I took a completely different approach to Ella, which I hope will be helpful. In that when I was given this task to do, I really thought about what could I add to what I'm sure was going to be a brilliant presentation, as was from Ella, because I wanted to think perhaps a little bit more about what we don't do in educational leadership research. So my focus of my presentation really is about, could we do something differently? What are the challenges and opportunities for that? And as an early career researcher, or as somebody working with doctoral or master's students, what are some options that perhaps I haven't thought of that I might like to come and think about? So I've entitled this, I kind of taken taken a little slightly different title, and I've called it Novel Methodologies for Research and Educational Leadership, which is spelt wrongly. I noticed that when I started, so sorry about that. But the sort of overall arching theme of this little presentation is about honouring different voices, the different voices of different researchers. And a few years ago, I was involved with at Coventry. It's not as pretty as Switzerland, I'm afraid, but it gives you quite a pretty picture of Coventry here. I was involved with putting together an online PhD programme, and part of that online PhD programme was looking at different ways of doing research in non-Western contexts. So we looked at Africa, we looked at Maori work. We made a real I suppose, a big part of the beginning of our programme to think, well, how can we do and think about research differently? So in this presentation, what I'm going to try and do over the next little while is think about different ways of using our umbrellas that we have when we're education researchers. How do we cluster things? What do we put them under? You know, can we do something that's a bit more challenging, that's a bit brighter, that's a bit different? Now, Ella's presentation actually coming first was really useful because she went into detail about what she did, and it just makes me think about, when we think about projects, are we brave enough sometimes to grab out the pink umbrella when actually you know, a black umbrella is safe? Especially if you're a doctoral student, you want to keep safe most of the time. And I'm going to use some examples from some of my current students to throw into the mix as I talk through this. So leaving the meta, I was going to sing, but then I thought I better not, about umbrellas. Because I do think we get very safe with what we do. I'm speaking as a person who's now a Professor Emeritus of Educational Leadership. I've just been thinking about what I've been doing over the years, and actually for me it's been all about meaning. It's about understanding the world through human experience, because I'm very much, if you've actually been forced to read any of my work, you'll know that I am very much an interpretist, and I do believe in constructionism, that we co-construct our research, our lives, etc., through language, culture, and interaction. And the last few years, because I've been doing a lot of work in South Africa, decolonial work, and as I say, work with looking at Maori research, which I'm sure you know more about than I do, some of you, but just how we form our research through our language and culture and interaction. And so in terms of meaning, I want you to think, as I talk in the next couple of minutes, about you and future students that you may have. In fact, I think somebody here is one of my ex-students, but we'll talk about that later. The focus for this little discussion is going to be on the narrative and the ethnographic. Now, when I did my own PhD many decades ago, I was really interested in storytelling approaches to educational research. And I was also interested in the work of Irving Seidman, who talked about returning to the interview. So you don't ever interview one person once, you go back to them with a second, and you go back to a third, and you get extra richness out of that approach to interviews. So I've always been a great fan of a narrative approach to research, and have used storytelling and of various kinds throughout my work. And I've also been heavily influenced by people I've worked with who are ethnographers. Now, I wouldn't say I'm an ethnographer, but I'm really interested in that approach. And in the last few years, as I've said, I've been quite interested in participatory action research, which is a methodology, or is it a philosophical approach? We could discuss that probably for hours, but we won't. But all of these things that I'm going to talk about today, I'm not going to talk about frameworks, particularly huge, big outside frameworks like postmodernism, feminism, decolonial theory, but all of these things that I'm talking about, I think, could be interesting and different set within a different framework. So that's what I'm going to try and do in the next little while. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about autoethnography. Could you give me a nod if you're a user? Have you used autoethnography, or you've worked with anyone on it? As I suspected. It's not used very much in educational leadership. There goes my light, come back. Yeah, So let me just explain a little bit about how I got involved with autoethnography very recently. So if we're in this qualitative inquiry, interpretivist, constructivist paradigm, and those narrative and ethnographic methods, it kind of leads to autoethnography, which is a very reflective research method. So let me just give you an example. One of my current students, it works in higher education in Africa. And she was very, very interested in how students are led through the different stages of their education to work inside or outside the continent of Africa. And we had real trouble starting her project. She really found it hard to get to grips with the project. And then somebody said to her, have you thought about writing this thesis as an autoethnography? And she said, no, not what's that? But it turned out that in her past life, she'd been a scriptwriter for a Nigerian television station. And what was interesting for me was there was a huge release in her ability to write about things critically as soon as she thought about things differently. So her thesis is an autoethnography, which has got sections of it which are written as scripts for a film about incidents and things that have happened. Because fortunately for her, and then you do need data, she had written a diary and she'd also written a blog over the last 5 years, so she could draw on that. So autoethnography, it's all about you. You are the person you need to examine. And it's a very reflective research method, as I said, and it's an opportunity, and certainly my student currently, to explore your identity as a leader, your values, and your ethical approaches or otherwise to incidents that have happened in your daily life. And it can be a very critical methodology because you can interrogate systems of privilege or inequity. And she's particularly found that in terms of transnational education in Africa and its relationship to students. And it can be, done well, a transformative approach. It really can focus, if you're a head teacher doing an autoethnography, you can focus on your own learning and organizational change. But it is very challenging. Some people think, oh, I'll do an autoethnography. I won't have to do all those interviews. I won't have to do focus groups. I won't have to spend hours analyzing data, which actually all of those things are not true. But they are something that people can think when they talk about autoethnography. And I thought to myself, what could we use it in terms of leadership research? Autoethnography, if you do one very well, contributes to that voice that I was saying, that democratization of the knowledge. But also, if you're a practitioner in a school, it's your theory building grounded in your own experience. Your own approach becomes part of your outcome to your research. And done well, again, there's a real focus, I think, in a good autoethnography about ethical insights that are often absent in some of the traditional leadership research that you can come across. Now, it is difficult, as I said, it's not the easiest of approaches, and it requires a really key balance between your own personal and analytical skills. So you need to take back, you know, the narrative to the theory, and back, as Ella was saying about back and forth in grounded theory, the same is very much true in autoethnography. It's no good just sitting down and writing piles and piles of words about nothing in particular. You've got to have that reflexive edge to it and bringing narrative and theory together. One of the theses that my student read was about applying particular race theories to his own life growing up as a black head teacher, and it was just interesting to see how that was all pulled together. Done well, I think it's a really impressive thing. I'm going to leave autoethnography to the side for a minute because I wanted to talk about one other novel approach that I've been trying out recently with again, one of my students, which I think could be actually part of a really big research project and very interesting, which is photo voice. Again, anyone use photo voice here? Oh, good. I'm going down different alleys today, aren't I? Right. Photo voice is where I'll just say a little bit about it. But again, it's a great way to give voice to the participants. And often it's used with marginalized groups. It began really in terms of research. It began in health education, in leadership in health, and has moved over. There's a few studies about using photo voice in higher education. And currently I have a student who's using Photo Voice, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. It's not in a leadership way. She's using it to unpick basically the experiences of international students in their first year at a UK university, full-time international students. And she wanted to find a way to validate their experiences without terrifying them because they're being part of research. And what happens with Photo Voice, in case you don't know the detail, is that your participants take photographs. And this is where I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you had to go to the phone box to ring your mother. This is where mobile technology is absolutely great. You take photographs representing aspects of your experience or your environment. So just to give you an example from Jennifer's project, the students were asked to take aspects of their settling in experience and their environment as they began to go to lectures. And then you pull all those together and you have focus groups or discussions or interviews, depending, where participants interpret and reflect on their images. And her work, she put it together and got an ESRC grant, a small grant for doctoral students, to do an exhibition of her research where she brought together the photos and the reflections. And interestingly enough, one of my other doctoral students was in the group. And she said she suddenly realized she was taking lots of pictures of food. And it was then that she realized that what she was missing was home. And the food was a metaphor for the home. The themes, as I say, are identified, and you have this dialogue. So it's both a research method and a tool for empowerment and advocacy. And if you think about schools and higher education, etc., I can see how you could do a really interesting study around aspects of distributed leadership, aspects of power, etc., in a school setting, a primary school, secondary school. But like all leadership studies, I think you run the risk when you do the study, when you put together the study and you write it up, of reproducing those binary relationships of authority that are implicit in leadership of whatever level that you're looking at it. Okay, so I can talk a little bit more about Photo Voice if you want to in a minute. I'm not sure where my timing is, but I'll keep going until Bernie gives me a stern look. So what are the challenges here? I think the challenges and the interest, autoethnography and Photo Voice for me have some similarities. They're very different, but they're similar. With autoethnography, you're researching the self to understand the system. And with Photo Voice, you're researching with others to transform the system or to understand the system better than you do already. And both are very qualitative, they're interpretive, they're reflective, but they differ in who generates the data and whose voice is foregrounded in the work. One of the interesting things that I found with both of these approaches is enjoyment. Now, I know you're not supposed to enjoy research really, but I think it's actually, Jennifer found that she got more participants to her study once she turned to Photo Voice, because the participants really enjoyed doing it, pulling the photographs together, putting on everything for that. And they also enjoyed seeing each other's perspectives in Photo Voice and seeing what other people were thinking about these aspects of their environment. Both of them, however, are challenging because they challenge those positivist assumptions of objectivity, because some of the criticisms of both autoethnography and Photo Voice are that they're not objective enough. Now, we could go down that route and discuss objectivity for hours, probably. But for me, the positive things about using them and the idea I wanted to bring them to you today was to think about how could we use such more novel approaches in leadership research, because these ones, particularly for me, as you know, my research has been a great deal about emotion and leadership. They foreground the emotional, ethical and relational dimensions of leading and learning, but can be viewed by colleagues as not really research. Autoethnography, what you're just writing about yourself, that's not research. So if you go for a novel approach, it's to understand that these novel approaches are in fact probably more demanding than some of the other approaches that we're more used to using, and they may require more defending at the end of the day. It's very easy to do a poor autoethnography, for example, but if you get a very good one you'll think, gosh, that really has taught me a lot about leadership that I never understood before. So the best approach for your research questions is always a piece of advice that I tell my students. And with these two approaches I've talked about in the last few minutes, the challenge is to maintain that coherence throughout and linking back to those research questions and changing them, as Ella said, as you move through the work. When I started as a lecturer, as an early career researcher, I was lucky enough to be across the corridor from Martin Hammersley at the Open University. And when I was putting this together, I thought if you haven't read some of Martin's work, it's still absolutely worth reading. Dig it out, especially if you're interested in ethnography in any sense. And he said this quote here: "What is involved here is not a crossroads where we go left or right. A better analogy is a complex maze where we're repeatedly faced with decisions and where the paths wind back on one another." And I think both of these approaches fit that, because you go forward, backwards, and then you bring it all together. So I'm sorry if I haven't really kept to the brief, but I wanted to get people to think about, are there different ways of doing investigations on these aspects of leadership that we've read a lot about. So that's me.
Thank you both for those fantastic presentations. Goodness, I think there's so much for us to think about, and I hope that there's also some inspiration, I think, for any doctoral students in the room, as well as those who are looking at new projects, etc. So we are going to move into the question and answer section of this session. We've got, I think, one question so far in the chat, but I'm sure there are others that people have written down, perhaps in their notes, etc. So I'll start with the one in the chat first, and then open up for any raised hands. So hopefully you've got access to the raised hand feature. If you click on the reaction button or react button, there's an option to raise your hand. So if you do have your question ready, please raise your hand, and then at least I can take the questions in order. So thank you, huge thank you again to Ella and Megan. I've got so many questions myself, but I'm going to contain myself. I must behave, and I will wait till the very end to ask my own. But first, we'll start with those in the room. Okay, so we've got a question from Amanda. Amanda, I don't know if you want to ask your question or